A dead man is found on an Australian beach with no name, no clear cause of death, and a hidden scrap of paper sewn into his clothing. Tonight, in the Midnight Ledger, we open one of the 20th century's strangest cold cases, the Somerton Man, Australia's strangest unidentified death. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, a man was found dead on a beach in Adelaide, Australia. He was lying on the sand near the seawall at Somerton Beach, dressed in a suit and polished shoes, his body arranged in a way that at first glance did not look violent, chaotic, or dramatic. There was no obvious sign of a struggle. No blood. No overturned scene. No immediate clue pointing to an attacker, an accident, or a desperate last moment. He looked, to some observers, almost as if he had simply leaned back to rest and never gotten up again. But almost nothing about him would stay simple for long, because the more investigators looked at this man, the stranger the case became. He had no identification. His labels had been removed from his clothing. The cause of death was uncertain. A tiny scrap of paper hidden in a secret pocket seemed to point toward something coded or deliberate or staged. A book connected to that scrap led police toward a string of possibilities involving poetry, cryptic writing, and the unsettling suggestion that this was not just a death, but a puzzle. And the man at the center of it all had no name. For decades, he would be known only by the place where he was found. The Somerton Man. It is one of the most famous unidentified death cases in history, not because it offers one perfect mystery, but because it offers too many. Every answer seems to open a new door. Every clue seems to carry two meanings. And even when later discoveries appeared to bring the case closer to resolution, the atmosphere around it never fully disappeared. Because this story is not just about who he was. It is about how he died, why he was there, and why so many details surrounding him feel less like ordinary coincidence and more like a carefully arranged silence. To understand why the Somerton Man still grips people, you have to start with the body on the beach. And then you have to follow the case the way investigators did, one detail at a time, one frustration after another, one clue that seemed promising, until it became strange again. The evening before the body was formally discovered, several people had already seen the man. He was noticed near the seawall at Somerton Beach on the evening of November 30th. Different witnesses later described seeing a man in a suit lying or sitting in roughly the same position. One person thought he might be drunk. Another believed he may have moved an arm, a small gesture that made him seem alive at the time. Just another figure resting near the shore in the fading light. Nothing about the scene, at least from a distance, screamed emergency. That detail matters, because it gives the case one of its first strange shadows. If the man did die there, then he may have died in public view without anyone realizing what they were witnessing. He was not hidden in an alley. He was not concealed in a locked room. He was on a beach, visible enough to be noticed, but ordinary enough to be overlooked. There is something haunting about that. Not just that he died alone, but that he may have passed through his final hours in plain sight, while strangers assumed he was merely tired, intoxicated, or waiting for something. By morning, he was dead. When he was examined, investigators found that he appeared to be in reasonably good physical condition. He was middle-aged, well-built, neatly dressed. He wore a jacket and tie, pressed trousers, shoes that suggested care rather than poverty, and clothing that made him look less like a drifter and more like someone who had moved through cities, train stations, or offices. He did not appear destitute. He did not appear obviously injured, and he did not appear to belong naturally to the beach where he was found. That feeling is difficult to quantify, but it lingers over the case. He seemed placed there by events we could not see. His pockets contained some ordinary items: a pack of chewing gum, a bus ticket, a used rail ticket, matches, cigarettes. Nothing at first glance that solved anything. But something else stood out almost immediately. All the labels had been removed from his clothes. That was strange enough on its own. Not one missing label, not one jacket altered for comfort. Systematically removed labels that instantly changed the emotional texture of the investigation. Because people do not usually remove every trace of identification from their clothes for innocent reasons. Not in that era, not in that way. It suggested concealment, preparation, or intent. Someone wanted his identity obscured. Maybe that someone was the man himself. Maybe it was someone else. Either possibility was disturbing, because if he erased himself, then the act was deliberate. And if someone erased him for him, then the case darkened immediately. Police began the routine work of identification: fingerprints, circulated photographs, inquiries about missing persons, questions to hotels, boarding houses, transportation networks. The hope in cases like this is always the same: that someone, somewhere, will recognize the face, the clothes, the build, the details, and say, "That is him. That is the man who checked in 3 days ago. That is the coworker who disappeared. That is the brother, the husband, the son, the traveler." But no one came. That silence made the case stranger. It is one thing for a man to die unexpectedly. It is another for him to die in a city without apparently belonging to anyone who will step forward. The longer that silence lasted, the more extraordinary it became. And then the autopsy complicated everything further. The pathologists did not find a clean, satisfying cause of death. They observed signs that led some to suspect poisoning, but no definite poison was identified. There were hints, impressions, possibilities, but not the kind of hard medical conclusion that closes a file and gives investigators a direction. This was crucial, because once you cannot confidently say how someone died, every other question becomes harder to anchor. If he had been stabbed, you would look for an attacker. If he had drowned, you would ask how he got to the beach. If he had suffered a heart attack, you might lean toward natural death. But uncertainty about the cause of death produces a special kind of investigative unease. It turns every object into a clue and every absence into a possibility. Was it suicide? Was it murder? Was it poison that could not be easily detected at the time? Was it a medical event that only looked suspicious because the rest of the case was so peculiar? The body gave no easy answer, and so the investigators kept pulling at details. Then they found the hidden pocket. Months after the man's death, while re-examining his belongings, investigators discovered something extraordinary. In the fob pocket of his trousers, a small hidden pocket had been sewn in. Inside it was a tightly rolled scrap of paper. On that paper were printed 2 words, "Tamam shud." The phrase comes from Persian and is often translated as ended or finished. The words had been cut from a book. And just like that, the case changed. Because this was no longer simply an unidentified dead man on a beach with removed labels and no obvious cause of death, now there was a hidden message. A concealed scrap of paper in a secret pocket, carrying words that sounded final, deliberate, and almost theatrical. Finished? Ended. To police, to journalists, and later to the public imagination, this felt like the sort of clue no ordinary case should have. It sounded like a signature left by fate, or by a planner, or by the dead man himself. If it were in a novel, it might have felt too perfect. But real life has a way of becoming even stranger than fiction when the facts align just wrong enough. Investigators traced the words to a book called The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. That was a famous work of poetry, translated into English in several versions, and often quoted for its reflections on fate, time, love, mortality, pleasure, and the fleeting nature of life. The phrase "Tamam shud" appeared at the end. So now the questions multiplied again. Had the dead man torn the phrase from the book himself? Was it meant as a suicide note, compressed into 2 words? Was it planted? Was it symbolic? Why hide it in a secret pocket? And how had the paper been cut so neatly and carried so long without explanation? Police appealed to the public for the specific edition of the Rubaiyat from which the fragment had come. And in one of those turns that makes old cases feel almost unreal, the book itself surfaced. A local man came forward after police appeals and said he had found a copy of the Rubaiyat in the back seat of his car, which had apparently been left there sometime around the period of the unidentified man's death. The exact chain of discovery has always contributed to the legend of the case, because it feels improbable in the way true mysteries often do. A stray book in a car, a torn fragment matching the words in the dead man's pocket, and inside that book, more strange material waiting to be found. Because on the back pages, investigators found indented writing and what appeared to be a code. The writing in the book was not a full message in plain language. It looked like a sequence of letters arranged in lines, possibly initials, possibly a cipher, possibly meaningless, and possibly something in between. This is where the Somerton Man case began to tilt in the public imagination toward espionage, because the late 1940s were not just any time. They were the early Cold War, a period when secrecy, coded communication, shifting allegiances, and intelligence paranoia were already alive in the background of public life. The idea of a dead, unidentified man with erased labels, uncertain cause of death, a hidden scrap of poetry, and possible coded writing did not feel like ordinary bad luck. It felt like something out of another world. Not supernatural, but clandestine, state-like, professional, dangerous. Even if the evidence never fully proved such a theory, the atmosphere of the case changed permanently at that point. And then there was a phone number found in the book. That number led police to a woman who lived not far from Somerton Beach. In many retellings, she is referred to as Justin, though that was not her real name. She had once owned a copy of the Rubaiyat. She had given one to a man years earlier, and when police showed her the plaster bust made from the dead man's body, witnesses later said her reaction was striking. Not hysterical, not dramatic, but enough to suggest recognition or shock. That has been one of the most discussed moments in the entire case. Did she recognize him? If so, from where? From her past? From war years? From intelligence work? From an affair? From something more ordinary that later generations have dressed in mystery? She denied knowing the dead man's identity, but her place in the case ensured that speculation would only intensify. Because now there was a woman near the beach with some connection to the same book, a reportedly notable reaction to the man's likeness, and no explanation that satisfied everyone watching from the outside. This is how great mysteries evolve. They do not simply add clues. They add emotional pressure. One new fact doesn't solve the previous one. It makes the whole structure feel more loaded, more deliberate, more likely to conceal a human story just beyond reach. Let's pause there for a moment, because this is the point in the story where the Somerton Man stops being only an investigation and becomes a myth-generating machine. Every major clue seems to belong to more than one possible narrative. The removed labels suggest concealment. But concealment by whom? The uncertain cause of death suggests poison. But poison of what kind? And administered by whom? The hidden Tamam Shud scrap suggests finality. But finality is literature, message, or performance. The book suggests connection. But connection to suicide, romance, espionage, or coincidence? The code suggests communication. But communication of importance, or simply idle markings misread as something larger? That is why this case endures. Not because it contains one impossible fact, but because every fact behaves like a double image. Turn it one way, it looks personal. Turn it another, it looks political. Turn it again, and it becomes tragic, random, almost painfully human. There are few mysteries more effective at producing theories because there are few mysteries more structurally generous. The case invites imagination, and once the espionage theory entered, it never really left. Australia in the late 1940s sat inside a world being rearranged by war's aftermath. Intelligence networks were active. Soviet and Western interests were real. Secrets moved through diplomatic channels, military circles, research institutions, and social spaces. To people inclined toward intrigue, the Somerton Man seemed to check the right boxes. An unidentified man, no labels, possible poison, code, cryptic book. A woman who might know more than she said. It almost read like an intelligence brief gone wrong. Perhaps he was a spy. Perhaps he was carrying information. Perhaps he was eliminated. Perhaps the code meant something serious. Perhaps the woman was involved. Perhaps everyone who officially spoke about the case was holding something back. These theories gained power because they explained not just the mystery, but the feeling of the mystery. They gave shape to the unease. But atmosphere is not proof. And one of the reasons the Somerton Man case remains so compelling is that the espionage explanation, while seductive, yet was never cleanly demonstrated. No badge of tradecraft appeared. No confirmed intelligence link was produced. No definitive decoded message emerged that transformed suspicion into certainty. The spy theory remains powerful, not because it is proven, but because it fits the emotional architecture of the case so well. There's another possibility, of course, that this was not espionage, but despair. The Rubaiyat has often been read as a book people associate with fatalism, mortality, and the passing pleasures of life. A scrap reading ended or finished, hidden in a secret pocket, can sound like a compressed farewell. If the man had chosen to die, then perhaps the phrase was his final statement. That theory has its own logic. A man traveling under obscured identity. A possible poison difficult to trace. A symbolic fragment from a book of poetry. No one claiming the body. A death in a lonely but public place. Taken together, those elements can suggest someone who intended to disappear. Someone who wanted to stage his own conclusion as an erasure. Someone who did not want to be found by name. But even that theory resists comfort. Because suicide, if that is what it was, still leaves unanswered why the labels were removed so completely, why no one ever came forward with certainty, why the book and markings existed in the form they did, and how the threads connecting him to others around Adelaide should be understood. And there is also a moral problem, almost an emotional one, in cases like this. People often reach for suicide not because the evidence is decisive, but because it offers closure. It is tidy in a way murder often is not. It gives the dead agency and gives the living a narrative endpoint. But tidy explanations can become evasions if they are used to flatten complexity. The Somerton Man does not flatten easily. If he chose death, he still constructed a mystery around himself. And if he did not choose death, then someone else may have done that construction for him. Either way, the staging, or apparent staging, remains. Then there's the possibility that the most dramatic elements of the case have distracted us from something simpler. This happens more often than people like to admit. A case becomes so wrapped in rumor, atmosphere, and repetition that its strangest pieces start to glow brighter than its ordinary ones. Once that happens, interpretation bends towards spectacle. Maybe the code was not really a code. Maybe it was phone-related notation, shorthand, or something trivial that later generations elevated because they wanted hidden structure. Maybe the hidden pocket was unusual, but not sinister. Maybe the Rubaiyat connection was important, but emotional rather than operational. Maybe the woman's reaction was simply the shock of a private recognition she did not wish to expose publicly. Maybe the man's death involved poison, but not murder. Maybe he was in personal crisis, socially disconnected, and more alone than anyone realized. Simple does not mean clear. Simple also does not mean emotionally easy. In some ways, the most painful version of the Somerton Man story is the least glamorous one. That a person drifted into the edge of society, died under ambiguous circumstances, and left just enough fragments behind to prevent the world from forgetting him, but not enough to restore his full humanity in time. Because that, too, is a kind of tragedy. And it may be the most common one of all. For years, the case sat in that suspended state, known worldwide, still unsolved, still discussed, still balancing between fact and projection. The dead man's image circulated endlessly. The bust made from his features became iconic. Articles revisited the mystery. Books, documentaries, and amateur investigators returned to the same set of clues and rearranged them into different theories. Each generation brought a new lens. Cold War suspicion, literary symbolism, forensic reevaluation, cryptographic curiosity, genealogical investigation, and that last category would eventually change the case more than any other, because modern science did what decades of witness recollection and interpretive theory could not. It pushed the identity question closer to an answer. After many years of efforts to obtain viable genetic material and compare it against genealogical databases, researchers eventually proposed an identification for the Somerton Man. The name most widely associated with that development is Carl Charles Webb, a man born in Melbourne. To many people, this felt like the missing key finally being inserted into the lock. At last, the unidentified man had a possible name. At last, the faceless mystery had a biography attached, or at least the beginning of one. And this was no small development. Identification matters. It restores personhood. It shifts a case from pure abstraction back toward lived life. But something interesting happened when that modern answer began to circulate. The mystery did not vanish, because identity was only one layer of the puzzle. Knowing or provisionally knowing who he may have been does not automatically tell us why he was at Somerton Beach. It does not tell us how he died. It does not fully explain the labels, the hidden scrap, the book, the possible code, or the human relationships around the case. This is one reason historical mysteries survive even after partial resolution. The public does not cling to them only because a name is missing. The public clings to them because the emotional architecture of the event remains unstable. You can know who someone was and still not know the story, and stories are what haunt us. So let's talk about what the Somerton Man really represents. It represents the fear of dying without context. A body can be found. A face can be photographed. Clothing can be cataloged. Pockets can be emptied. But without a clear chain of meaning, a person becomes strangely unreachable. And that is what makes unidentified cases so powerful. They remind us how much of identity lives outside the body. It represents the instability of evidence. A clue is not always a fact. A fact is not always an answer. One object can point in opposite directions depending on what story you think you are in. The Somerton Man case demonstrates that beautifully and maddeningly. Almost every piece of evidence feels interpretable rather than decisive. It represents the Cold War instinct to suspect hidden structures. Not everything mysterious is espionage. But once a case emerges during a time of state secrecy and global tension, ordinary ambiguity begins to look planned. The Somerton Man arrived in exactly that atmosphere. And maybe most of all, it represents the seductive power of incompleteness. A solved case leaves records. An unsolved case leaves room. And room is where imagination builds cathedrals. There's a reason the Rubaiyat matters so much in this story, even beyond the torn phrase. Poetry transforms evidence. If police had found a grocery list in a hidden pocket, the case would still be strange, but it would not feel the same. If the dead man had carried a fragment of a timetable or a hotel receipt or a business card, the mystery would remain grounded in procedure. But a torn line from a book of verse introduces mood. It drapes the case in reflection, mortality, philosophy, and dramatic finality. Finished. Ended. Those words do not merely inform, they resonate. And once resonance enters an investigation, public memory changes. People do not just remember what happened, they remember how it felt. That may be why the Somerton Man refuses to become merely historical. He remains atmospheric, he remains cinematic, he remains the kind of case people encounter once and then carry for years. Not because they have memorized the facts, but because the image of him never quite leaves. The man in a suit on the beach, the missing name, the hidden words, the book in the car, the woman who may have known, the code that may or may not be a code, the sense that the truth is sitting just beyond the edge of what can be proven. Imagine the case from the perspective of the investigators in 1948. No internet, no instant national databases, no genetic genealogy, no ability to rapidly cross-reference every missing person across continents in a matter of seconds. You have a body, a beach, a suit, removed labels, uncertain pathology, a scrap of poetry, and a public already beginning to sense that this is not an ordinary death. You chase every lead you can. You interview, you publish images, you test what you can test. And still, the case holds back. There's something almost cruel about that. The man is close enough to touch, but far away in every way that matters. People often speak about old mysteries as if investigators missed something obvious. Sometimes they did, but often they were trapped inside the limits of their era. They were staring at the right clues without yet having the tools that might make those clues speak. The Somerton Man is one of those cases where time itself became part of the investigation. Each decade changed what it could be asked. At first, who is he? Then, was he poisoned? Then, what does the book mean? Then, is this espionage? Then, can the code be solved? Then, can DNA restore his identity? And through all those phases, one thing never changed. The dead man himself said nothing. Everything in the case is inference. Everything is built from traces. Everything depends on how much weight you place on fragments. So what is the most likely truth? It may be that the Somerton Man was not a spy, but a private man whose life fractured in ways no one publicly understood. It may be that he traveled under circumstances shaped by personal distress, secrecy, and failed relationships rather than geopolitics. It may be that poison was involved, but in a way medicine at the time could not definitively capture. It may be that the poetry fragment meant exactly what it appears to mean, a final gesture compressed to 2 words. It may also be that parts of the case were genuinely staged, but staged for intimate reasons rather than international ones. That possibility to me is one of the most convincing and one of the saddest. Not a grand conspiracy, not a master spy, not a coded handoff in the shadows of empire, just a human being with a hidden life, making choices that ended in ambiguity and leaving behind a death dramatic enough to outlive him. But even that remains in the end only a possibility, because the Somerton Man punishes confidence. Every time the case seems about to settle into one explanation, another detail starts to pull it loose again. And maybe that is why this case has lasted. Not because it is unsolved in the purest technical sense, but because it lives at the intersection of 3 forces people cannot resist: death, identity, and secrecy. A dead body asks what happened. An unknown identity asks who. A hidden clue asks why. Put those 3 together, and the result is almost impossible for the human mind to leave alone. We want causes, we want names, we want narrative order. The Somerton Man offers all 3 in damaged form, enough to compel, never enough to satisfy. That is the engine of the mystery. On that summer morning in Adelaide, the man on the beach was just one more silent body in a world that had already seen too much war, too much displacement, too much upheaval. But history is selective about what it preserves. Some people die with complete records and are forgotten almost at once. Others leave behind almost nothing and become impossible to forget. The Somerton Man became unforgettable because his absence was so textured. No name, but elegant clothes. No labels, but careful grooming. No clear cause, but suspicious circumstances. No note, but a final phrase. No confession, but the shape of intention. No identified life, but signs of a story. And perhaps that is the deepest strangeness of all. He became famous not in spite of what was missing, but because of it. The gaps made him permanent. Today, if the later identification is correct, we may finally be closer to restoring the man behind the case. That matters. It matters morally. It matters historically. It matters because a person should not remain forever reduced to a riddle if the truth can be responsibly recovered. But even if his name is now closer to us than it once was, the Somerton Man will probably never lose the aura that gathered around him. Because some cases do not survive on facts alone. They survive on atmosphere, on one image, one phrase, one unresolved emotional note. And Somerton Beach gave the 20th century one of its most enduring. A man alone at the edge of the sea, dressed for a life we cannot fully reconstruct, carrying words that seem to announce an ending, and leaving behind a story that even now doesn't feel finished at all. Maybe the truest thing we can say about the Somerton Man is this. For decades, the world looked at him and saw mystery first, person second. That is understandable. The clues almost force that response. But beneath the code, beneath the poetry, beneath the rumor of spies and hidden lovers and secret pockets, there was a real life. A man who was once a child somewhere, then an adult known to someone, then a traveler, then a body on a beach, then a legend. Mystery can preserve memory, but it can also flatten humanity. So perhaps the final task of this case is not only to solve it, it is to remember that the unknown man was never only unknown. He was someone. And whether the world has finally found his name or only come closer than before, the real sadness of Somerton is not that it generated theories. It is that one human life had to disappear so thoroughly before the world decided it could not stop. The Somerton Man belongs in the Midnight Ledger because it has all the marks of a case that refuses to stay buried. A body on a beach, a hidden phrase in a secret pocket, labels removed, a death without a clear cause, and a life erased so thoroughly that mystery became the only thing left behind. This is exactly the kind of story the ledger was made to keep. Not just unsolved, but unnervingly unfinished. The Somerton Man is more than a cold case. It is a record of silence, secrecy, and the unsettling truth that some lives vanish so completely they return as legend.